There are some really fascinating documents that come out of the post-war years that pertain to the decision that each family got to make about what they wanted done with the remains of their loved ones. And the federal government has played a role in burying soldiers prior to the Second World War. There are national cemeteries in the Civil War, Gettysburg and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous examples. But there's no choice there. The soldiers are buried close to where they fall. In fact, the whole reason to have national cemeteries at all is because these battles are so massive and there's just no way for the federal government to return the remains. In the First World War, there is more of a choice, but it's incredibly onerous for a small group of federal employees to process the family's choices and to deal individually with each grieving family. And so in the Second World War, you see a much more developed infrastructure and bureaucracy to deal with the issues that come up with something as precious as the remains of a loved one when you have to deal with 400,000 grieving families. One of the things that comes out of these documents is the fact that Americans will have a choice what they want done with the remains of their loved ones. There is a brochure called Disposition of World War II Armed Forces Dead, which explains to the next of kin the options that they have. And there's a couple of really fascinating things as you go through. One is how much effort goes into creating a system to identify the next of kin. This is the person who will have the burden of making the decision about where the remains will wind up. There's a second part for soldiers who were married. What the pamphlet doesn't show is, I think, why there is such a codified hierarchy, and that's because there is some debate about who should make this really important choice. It does not go smoothly for every family. There are some quickie marriages, soldiers who are going off to the combat theaters, young men who want to get married and do so very quickly. In some cases, marrying a young woman that they've met training or at a port of debarkation, and that woman who becomes a widow may have never met her husband's family, may never have met the parents. The parents may not feel particularly warmly about a young woman who married a soldier who was shipping off. It's very easy to cast a woman like that as an opportunist, and that causes all sorts of acrimony and finger pointing. And so this is an effort to explicitly codify who's going to make the choices. There's a fascinating 15-minute government film that accompanies the pamphlet called simply The Decision. And the film opens on the family making this decision, the young widow reading the brochure, and her mother-in-law is sewing and answering questions.
I can select a cemetery at home or overseas.
What are you going to do?
I don't know, Mother. What do you think I should do?
And you get the sense that they have moved beyond the immediate raw portion of their grieving. They have not just learned of the soldier Jimmy's death, a few weeks prior, that they have been living with the fact of his absence and his death for several years at this point.
I'll answer it. Come on, Julie. Hello, Henry.
Morning, Martha.
Won't you come in?
The other main character is the local neighborhood milkman, who is really there to answer questions as the voice of the government and to help guide the widow through the process of making the decision.
Henry, what did your father do? I mean, where did he want George to be buried?
U.S. Military Cemetery in Hawaii. That's the way George would have wanted it.
Jimmy's in a temporary United States cemetery in France. Henry, maybe you could help me make up my mind.
Be glad to.
A character who appears at the very end of the film, as the widow is making her decision. A man knocks at the door wearing a suit, and he offers to see to the burial of her husband in Europe himself.
Yes?
Well, I am in a position to make all arrangements for you. I have numerous contacts in France, and for a nominal cost, say $50, you can put everything in my hands.
And the milkman, the voice of the government, is very angry with the appearance of this man who he refers to as a racketeer.
I don't like the way you talk, young man.
That goes double for me. Why, you're just a racketeer trying to cash in on the sorrow of mothers and wives and everybody else who's lost somebody in the war. Well, you're barking around the wrong door. The War Department arranges everything, get it? Everything, without cost.
And there's just no reason for that character to be included in the film unless that's a real phenomenon, unless there were opportunistic men trying to exploit families' grief and their lack of familiarity with exactly what the United States government was willing to do. And the milkman character, I think, does a nice job of gently selling the ABMC cemeteries.
Whatever is done, a permanent cemetery will be nicely kept up. Grass and trees and flowers, well, just like you'd see back home. Bill McDonald, this quartermaster sergeant I knew, told me about a military cemetery in Italy. It was surrounded by the most beautiful mountains he'd ever seen. And not far away were olive groves. He said some of the Italian people were so grateful about being liberated from the Nazis that they keep putting flowers and wreaths on the Americans' graves.
And all those things are true. In the film, they can't show the cemeteries yet because the cemeteries haven't been built. And in fact, they can't even say how big they're going to be.
I saw one of them in Hawaii. I mean one of those temporary military cemeteries. They call them temporary because the War Department can't tell you how big a place they'll need for a permanent burial ground.
When you look at these documents, the pamphlet, the film, when you look at the cemeteries themselves, one of the unavoidable insights is the amazing lengths to which the United States government went after the Second World War to pay tribute to those who had lost their lives in the country's service, and to help in whatever way they could the families with their grief and their loss. And it's remarkable looking at these documents to see the lengths to which they went to do that.